Well, good morning, everybody. We'll make a start. I'm really hopeful to get quite a lot of discussion over the 4 sessions, but we're starting a little bit later today, so I may not get much time for that. So it's part 2 of Genesis 1 to 3, Truth or Fiction. And what I'd like you to do, if you will, is to vote in your head. Do not put your hands up for these questions. So I want you to have a sense of where you think you are about these questions. Do you believe that God created the heavens and the earth in 7, or we could say 6, 24-hour periods? Do you believe that the earth was created somewhere between 6 and 10,000 years ago? Do you believe there were a real Adam and Eve? Think about your responses to that. Or were they fictional characters? And do you believe, if there were a real Adam and Eve, that they ate an apple, they disobeyed God, they sinned, and we've inherited their sinful nature? So you'll have a view of all of those questions. I'm not going to ask you. Not yet, anyway. So the big question, and I think it is a big question, and I think it really, really matters. It matters to me desperately, because I suppose I've spent quite a lot of my life looking at this kind of stuff, but I think it matters to all of us. How do we relate Genesis 1 to 3, the accounts of the origins of the earth and of life, with modern science? And modern science, the consensus, there's never full agreement in science. The consensus is that the earth is very old. It's at least 4 billion years old. The consensus is that we are descended by evolution from simpler animals through an evolutionary process. So there appears to be a big gap between those two. So it's a big issue. So how do we reconcile those? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with it in terms of our own faith? And I think it's really important for us to understand that evangelicals don't agree. Now, you go to an evangelical church. You go to a church where the Bible is held in very high regard, where we use the Bible as the infallible source of authority for what we believe and how we behave, for our morality. So how do we reconcile those two things? Even evangelicals, those who hold a very high view of the Bible, disagree. And it fascinates me how broad evangelicalism is. It fascinates me. There are an enormous range of views over this and other issues too, among Christians who hold the Bible in very high regard. So it's a big issue. And I think it raises a number of other issues as well. So, for example, how did the universe begin? I'm a creationist, but let me be careful. I believe that God created the world. So that's basically going to be the only thing I say about my beliefs for the next 4 sessions. I believe that God created the world. But how did he do that? And how long did he take to do it? And what processes were used? That's a different question. How old is the earth? Are we misreading Genesis 1 to 3 if we see it as young, a young earth? We'll come on to that. How did life actually start? And how did it then process and move on? Was it through an evolutionary process or not? Did humans evolve from other animals? So there's a lot of sub-issues going on here. Should we read Genesis 1 to 3 literally? And is there a danger in assuming that we are reading it literally, when maybe the meaning was slightly different from what we thought? Can you do science and be a Christian if there appears to be such a gap between the biblical account and the scientific account? My response to that would be, tell Francis Collins that he can't be a scientist and a Christian. He's the man who led the team that cracked the whole genetic code, and he is a scientist and a Christian. Is the Bible a science textbook? Should we look for scientific truth in the Bible? And why does it matter? Who cares? Why does it matter? Well, I care very much, and I hope you do too. And I want to illustrate why it matters. I was listening to the very interesting programme on Radio 4. It's still on, it's been going for a number of years, called Beyond Belief. Some of you may have listened to it. And they were talking to a man who was an evangelical Christian, an American. So he had held the Bible in high authority. And he wanted to become a member of his church. He believed in all the doctrines, no problem. He believed that Jesus was his saviour, but he happened to believe in evolution. And the church said, I'm sorry, you can't be a member unless you accept that evolution is wrong. Now, I once said to a female student in one of my classes, is it important that you believe in evolution, that evolution is untrue in your church as well as other doctrines? And she said it's really important. We think that you must reject evolution if you're going to be a conservative evangelical Christian. That's in a church quite near here, and I'm not going to tell you which one it was. There's a fierce debate going on among Christians, among evangelical Christians actually, as well as others, about Genesis 1 to 3. And it raises, I believe, the most fundamental of all questions. How do we read the Bible? How do we read it? How do we make sense of it? What is optional? Do we sometimes misunderstand it? Now, I'm going to give you a couple of really stupid examples, and they're well-known examples. There was a man who was seeking real guidance from God, so he opened his Bible and he read, Judas went and hung himself. So he thought, no, that can't be right. So he opened it again at another place, the classic example of how not to read the Bible, and he read there, go and do thou likewise. Now, you know, that's the classic misreading of the Bible, but do we misread it sometimes in more subtle, nuanced ways? When Judy and I were first going out, Judy had a little promise box. Some of you may be old enough to remember it. And you would pull out a verse, and it would be kind of a verse for the day. And it was good, it was nice. But boy, how not to read the Bible. How not to read the Bible. No context given whatsoever. So it really matters. And then what has been for me part of my kind of teaching life. And if you come across the book, The God Delusion, yeah? Very, very, very highly published book. Some years ago I went into Winchester Blackstones, or was it Waterstones, and I was looking at the religion section and there was virtually no religion section. But there was a big section on Richard Dawkins' books, and that should tell us something. He believes that belief in God is a delusion. Now, it's a very bad book. Lots of atheists criticise it. It's a very bad book in all sorts of ways, but it's had a powerful impact on young people who've come to believe sometimes that what Christians believe is just silly. It's non-scientific, it's ridiculous, and it's led people out of faith. To encourage you, I recently read a book called Coming to Faith Through Dawkins. And it was a number of people who'd actually been atheists, been impressed by Dawkins, begun to read him more carefully and become Christians through a long process. So the tragedy is that some people now have that in their heads, particularly over the evolution debate. And especially in America, many young people are brought up in what they would call Bible-believing churches that teach that evolution is nonsense, is rubbish, and they then go to college and they come across the opposite being taught, and they're thrown into chaos and confusion and doubt and uncertainty. And many of us would argue that's not necessary. There's no need for that. So it's a really serious, big issue. And it also, by the way, in Genesis 3, raises a very profound issue, and we'll be looking at that particular concern, a theological concern, in the last of my 4 sessions. So why does it matter? I think it matters very, very much indeed. So we're going to look over 4 sessions actually over three sessions, at different ways of interpreting Genesis 1 to 2. And we're going to deal with just one of them today. And I'm going to put it in this kind of a table because scholars seem to be doing this. I'm going to put different views, first of all, under discordant, views that say science is wrong, the Bible is right, we can't get an agreement. But I'm also going to look at concordant views, views that say actually science and religion can perfectly well go hand in hand. And certainly one of the topics I used to have to teach was the relationship between science and religion. And it's a very interesting area to look at and much more complex than people like Dawkins would have you believe. So let's just look at the different views. Evolutionary naturalism. I love long words, isn't it great? If you want to impress people, learn 10 long words and trot them out at a party. Evolutionary naturalism, we'll come back to that one. Basically, evolution is true. We are nothing but matter. That's what we are. And it's formed from the dust and it goes to the dust. And there is no God, and evolution explains everything we need to know. I'm not even going to say anything about this one. It's not a widely held view, but we will be looking at it in a later session, the omphalos theory. So I'll leave a teaser with you there. Evolutionary creationism. People like Dennis Alexander, Francis Collins, John Polkinghorne, amazingly prestigious scientists who are also Christians, who believe that God created through the mechanism of evolution. So there's a lot of very, very famous Christian scientists who would hold that view. Those people who hold that actually Genesis 1 to 3 is poetry. It may be even mythical. It's not literally true, but behind it, Christians would argue, there's an enormous amount of truth. The kind of truths that Ken was talking about last week. So they may not take it literally, and they may well be evangelicals, but they would argue that there are deep and profound truths within Genesis 1 to 3. Day-age theory. No, it wasn't 7 or 6 24-hour periods. Each period was actually thousands or millions of years. Each day was an age. That's a very commonly held view among many evangelical Christians. Some of them very much so as well, who really, really would hold absolutely to the authority of the Bible, but would accept that kind of day-age theory. The gap theory. I am going to get Judy just to quickly read this, if you will. The gap theory says there's an enormous gap between Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 and Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, and it was a gap of millions of years, and that's how we explain this. So if you wouldn't mind just very loudly reading those two verses.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters.
That's brilliant, thank you very much. So there's a gap. This is what these folk would argue. There's an enormous time gap between Genesis 1 verse 1 and Genesis 1 verse 2. So that's another kind of, it's been called old earth creationism kind of theory. And then progressive creationism, again something we'll look at briefly later on. The one I want to focus on today is, and I'm sure you've heard of it, young earth creationism. Yeah, can you put your hands up if you've come across that? Quite a few people have. Young earth creationism. Very, very, very strong and big in America. And to a degree here actually as well. So the idea is that the earth is young. It's between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. Science is wrong, and evolution is wrong. Adam and Eve are absolutely real historical figures, and they did disobey God, and they did fall into sin, which we've inherited. So why have I put an arrow onto the other side with a question mark? Well, I'm going to say it anyway rather than attempt to go back, because they attempt to say their science is real science. Science, the consensus is wrong. Their science is real science and is much more accurate and much more reliable. So they do claim that their biblical position fits well with science. It's a minority view, but that's what they would claim. So I want to just start, before we look at it, with some preliminary considerations. These are probably factually true. Genesis 1 is similar to other ancient creation stories. And that has to be taken into account when we look at Genesis 1 and 2. I've given you one example, but there are others. It is very definitely similar to, and some scholarly books will actually list the similarities. There are also differences, and they're important ones. Many of the ancient accounts are what I call polytheistic. They believe in many gods. Genesis 1 and 2 is clearly monotheistic, one God. There's one point of difference. We need to be aware, because we view the Bible through 21st century eyes, and we can't escape that. There's no way out of that. We are subjective people. So we need to recognise that Genesis was written to pre-scientific people with what's been called by scholars an ancient Near Eastern outlook. An outlook in which there was a flat earth covered by a dome with little gaps through which the rain would come. Yeah, they had a very different view of the world from us. And we need to always ask that question: how would people then have written what they wrote and received what was given? And I'm going to repeat that point in a minute. Some scholars, and there is disagreement about this, and one of the joys of looking at biblical scholarship is how little agreement there is sometimes. Some scholars believe that Genesis 1 and 2 may well be different accounts. It may well be that an editor took two accounts of the creation and put them together. One piece of evidence, and it is a hotly debated issue, is that in one of the chapters God is called Elohim, Lord. In another chapter he's called Yahweh, and Ken pointed this out last week. But there's other evidence for and against. I've already mentioned what was intended, what was received. People who really give authority to the Bible major on this. What was the intention of the author when they were writing? And how would it have been received by those who heard it? Very, very important that we get that. And when we do, it helps us not to misunderstand and misinterpret the Bible. It really does. Very important. And again, sorry guys, no scholarly agreement on this. Some scholars think that Genesis was written by Moses in the desert, maybe sometime between about 1200 and 1400 BC. Other scholars believe that it's post-exilic. In other words, it was written beyond 586 when Israel went in, or Judah went into exile and then returned. So that it was actually written much later than the period it's describing. Again, there's no scholarly agreement. Personally, I'm not sure it terribly matters. It depends kind of the stance you take. So there's the preliminary considerations. Let's start with my old favourite. Somebody tell me, who is that? I can hear the word Darwin being muttered, yeah. Judy and I used to live near where he actually lived. He had a quite nice house actually. Darwin was not the first person to put forward the idea of evolution, but in many ways he's, I suppose, the most well known. But he didn't necessarily believe in evolutionary naturalism, and we need to be really aware of this. Evolutionary naturalism teaches evolution is true, therefore God doesn't exist. Does that make sense? Evolution is true, therefore God doesn't exist. Evolution entails atheism. We are nothing but material. We believe we have freedom, we don't. We're just the product of chemicals and hormones and electrical activity. That's what we are. Materialism, the material world and universe, is all that exists. Richard Dawkins is particularly associated with this. That is a fallacious argument. It is a fallacy. It is illogical reasoning in all sorts of ways. What it actually is an unprovable worldview. You may believe in evolution, but it doesn't mean you therefore must be an atheist. And what really upsets me when folk like Dawkins do this is they portray their worldview as if it were science. Objective science. We all have this sense, don't we, that science is truth, science is fact. Okay? And so if you can dress up a worldview as science, you're onto a winner. There is a real problem, and we need to recognise that whenever we hear people like Richard Dawkins and others similar. It's not a scientific evolutionary theory, it's a worldview, unprovable. And that's really important for us to be aware of. It is the case that evolution is the current dominant theory in science. There are some quite significant criticisms being made of it recently, actually, but it is the case. But I always want to be careful with science, and I want to quote a scholar that I used to use years ago when I was teaching, and he went through a process something like this. Well, there have been many attempts to disprove evolutionary theory over the last 100 or so years, and all these different attempts, and they've all failed. So what should we say about evolution? So far, so good. Do you get the point? So far, so good. And one of the things that really annoys scientists, and I love to do this because I wasn't a scientist, really annoys scientists, is I say there's no such thing as truth in science. There is only what is currently held to be the truth. What is currently held to be the consensus agreement within science. And you only have to look at the last 100 years to come across that. What was the dominant theory in physics until about 100 years ago? Newtonian physics. What's coming in now? Quantum physics and beyond quantum physics. And who was one of the key people who fought against the whole idea? Albert Einstein, until he eventually admitted actually he'd probably got it wrong. So science changes, it progresses, but it also changes. It's the current dominant theory. Many Christians support evolution, many Christians who are scientists, and very, very eminent scientists. John Polkinghorne, very, very well known. Francis Collins, the American man who led the team that broke the genetic code. His book is fabulous, by the way, and it's incredibly readable. It's called The Language of God. Genetics, the language of God. Well worth a read. My favourite writer, my favourite defender of the Christian faith, Keith Ward, who I once had the privilege of talking to for about 30 seconds. He makes the point so well in his books. Evolution doesn't answer the big questions. It can't. Science can't. Science doesn't tell me the meaning and purpose of my life. Science doesn't tell me if there is a spiritual reality. Science can't do that. That's not what science is. Arguably, it's more debatable, science can't tell us how to behave either. That's for morality and ethics. So I think we want to probably dispense with evolutionary naturalism. Who do you think said that? A gentleman called Charles Darwin said that. Seems to me absurd to doubt that a man could be a theist and an evolutionist. And although it is the case that Darwin lost his faith, that is true, there's a very good reason why he lost his faith, and it wasn't to do with evolution. It was because his daughter died, and because his brother also had terrible trauma, and he couldn't come to terms with suffering and pain in the world and a good and loving God. And we always have to provide answers to those kind of issues as well. They're the biggest questions we face as Christians. So that's evolutionary naturalism. You may have gathered that I have a bit of a problem with it on logical grounds. So let's come to its opposite. Let's look at young earth creationism. So I'd like you to think for a minute again. Do you remember? Think about what you thought in the first slide. Do I believe that the earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old? Do I believe there was an Adam? Do I believe that the world was formed in 6 24-hour periods? And I know there's some issues around that. So I want to start, and I want to be as neutral as I possibly can here. I want to start by looking at the arguments in favour of young earth creationism. The kind of arguments that very, very bright, intelligent people, scientists, biblical scholars, theologians put forward. Firstly, young earth creationists major on the genealogies. You know, you remember in the New Testament, there's a list, isn't there, which runs from Adam to Jesus and so on. And there's one in Genesis as well. And they say, if you actually count the years between the genealogies, particularly from Adam to Abraham, and then look at what happens after Abraham, the earth must be young. It must be younger than about 10,000 years, if you go by the genealogical record. They reject the idea that Genesis is poetry. They say, come on, we treat the rest of Genesis as history. We treat Exodus and Numbers 1 and 2 and Numbers and 1 and 2 Kings as history. We should be treating the whole of Genesis as history. It's not poetry. They look at the Hebrew word yom, and they say it always means a 24-hour day whenever you read it in the Old Testament. Why should we treat it differently in Genesis 1? It always means a 24-hour period. They point out that Jesus treated characters such as Adam and Eve as literally true, and so did Paul. They argue that the fossil record doesn't reveal an old earth, as other scientists claim. They argue that the fossil record was laid down by the flood. You remember? Noah's Ark and the flood and so on. So these are the kind of arguments they make. They argue that for 18 centuries the church taught a 5,000-year-old earth. Why are we now rejecting that? And interestingly, and this is a very significant point, they argue that if you believe in evolution, you're believing in something that in its outcome, not its intent, in its outcome is cruel, wasteful, destructive, completely opposite to our understanding of God. So they are very, very hostile to the idea of evolution, and I'll be looking again in a few minutes at why that's the case. And they make the point that I suspect we'd all agree with, that God is perfectly capable of making fully formed plants, animals and humans in 6 24-hour periods. There's nothing to stop him doing that, is the kind of argument that they make. Now there's much, much, much more. That is a kind of scoot through the main points of young earth creationism. And a lot of serious biblical scholars, in America particularly, are young earth creationists. So what are the arguments against young earth creationism? First of all, and I'm a bit cautious about this word literal, a literal reading of the Bible. The critics claim that young earth creationists come to the Bible with a particular view already held, that you take things literally as much as you possibly can. And critics would say that's not always the way to read the Bible. Critics would claim that YEC, or young earth creationism, ignores the world view of ancient people who wrote and understood Genesis. It kind of imposes our own 21st century understanding on the Bible. Critics would say the fossil record shows a layered sequence of life forms. There are huge debates about that one, and they're way beyond my capability to understand. Layered sequence of life forms over millions of years. Critics would say radioactive dating shows a very old Earth, when you look at that very carefully. And the evidence for the Big Bang, they would say, is really very strong. And if we have any time at the end, we could look at what that evidence is. And it's certainly very much the consensus position among scientists, although it's raising all sorts of other bigger issues. It is really very strong, the critics would say. And there is really strong evidence, I don't know if you'd come across this, that the universe is expanding. And not only is it expanding, in other words, everything is getting further and further apart, but the expansion is speeding up. Now, the logic of the argument, therefore, is if there's an expansion going on and you work backwards, you end up with a very small, utterly dense point that exploded and produced an expanding universe. Some critics in science say, actually, once it reaches the limit of its expansion, it will actually contract back down to a single point, and all I can say is, don't worry, we won't be there to see it. So the universe is expanding. These are the kind of arguments that they make. And a number of Christians who are scientists reject young Earth creationism. So arguments for and against. And we need to be very aware of those kind of arguments that are going on and passionate disagreements. Now, what I'd like to do, and it is really tentative, I want to stress this is not giving away my view on this. I want to try a very tentative assessment. There are reasons why young Earth creationists are so hostile to evolutionary theory. Those of you who'd studied Nazi Germany for your history, like me, that would have been a long time ago, I know, will know that Nazism embraced a philosophy called social Darwinism. That societies, races are struggling against one another. And only the strongest and fittest will survive and deserve to survive. And we Nazis, with our anti-Semitism, have to prove that we deserve to survive by destroying other races and beginning a world war. So social Darwinism is a pretty unpleasant kind of philosophy, and it really, really upsets many young Earth creationists. They just have a real animus, anger against evolutionary theory. There is an assumption, and I'm guessing, I don't know this, that not all young Earth creationists would hold this view, that not only should the Bible be read as literally as possibly, but that it's inerrant, it's without any error. There are no mistakes in the Bible. There are no contradictions or difficulties in the Bible. It also claims that the Bible is correct scientifically. Where the Bible makes claims that could be seen as being scientific, then the Bible is right and modern science may be wrong. We need to be aware, whenever we look at Genesis, that there are genuine similarities between ancient Near Eastern literature. The Enuma Elish, I'm not even sure I can say that, Atrahasis and Gilgamesh are three of those. But I've pointed out there are also differences. First century Jewish philosopher Philo didn't believe in taking Genesis 1 literally. Second century Origen didn't take Genesis literally. Augustine actually took what you might call an even more conservative view. He said God created everything in an instant. He didn't need 6 24-hour periods. He did it in a heartbeat. So there's kind of all those ways of trying to assess young Earth creationism. I was listening recently to some scientists who are Christians. One of them is called John Lennox, if any of you have heard of him. Hugely interesting man. He spent much of his career travelling the world defending the Christian faith. And to my absolute delight, when my daughter and son-in-law and children moved house in Oxfordshire, they lived next door to him. And I've met him. Isn't that fabulous? But he was part of a tripartite discussion, and he said at one point, you know, the reason why people like you don't get jobs in universities in America is that there's a bias against young earth creationists. They don't want people like that in the universities. There's a bias going on. Is that true? I don't know. So that's my tentative assessment, without saying whether I think young earth creationism is true or false. And I'd like to kind of draw to an end by quoting some people. And I'm going to quote Augustine. Now, I'm not a fan of Augustine. I've got all sorts of issues with him. But boy, is he a very important Christian thinker. One of the 3 or 4, perhaps most important Christian thinkers there's ever been. And this is one of the things he said about the days in Genesis. What kind of days these were, it's extremely difficult to determine. So that's interesting. And we'll quote him again, but a bit greater length. In matters that are obscure, different interpretations are sometimes possible. In such a case, we shouldn't firmly take our stand. That if further progress in the search for truth undermines our position, we too fall with it. That would be to battle not for the teaching of Holy Scripture, but for our own. And I think that's a really interesting way of kind of summarising where we've got to in terms of understanding Genesis 1 and 2. But to end, I'd like to actually take a slightly... one other thing I want to say. Young earth creationism wasn't very popular until about 1961. Most people wouldn't have been young earth creationists if they were Christians. Do you remember I was talking, was it 2 Sundays ago, about the Scopes trial? Were you in church when I mentioned that? The famous monkey trial. William Jennings Bryan, who was the prosecuting attorney, wasn't a young earth creationist, even though he didn't believe in evolution. He wasn't a young earth creationist. It didn't become a very fashionable belief until 1961, when a book called The Genesis Flood was published by Henry Morris, who was an engineer, and John Whitcomb, who was a Bible scholar. And with the coming of that book, young earth creationism has grown very much, particularly in America. Okay, so I want to move away from that, and I want to just get our heads around what does it mean to be evangelicals, and then I will finish. I've got 4 minutes. Okay, so we need to be really clear that what do evangelicals believe? They believe that the Bible is the authoritative word of God, that it's inspired by the Holy Spirit, that it's trustworthy for faith and conduct, that it's a source for guidance in our lives, and it has a plain meaning. You know, it means what it wants to mean. But there's a huge disagreement within the evangelical world between whether we take it literally or sometimes non-literally. There's an enormous disagreement. And there's an even bigger disagreement among evangelicals about for those who believe it's without any errors or contradictions at all, and those who say, well, there may be, but when it comes to faith and practice, it's infallibly true and reliable. Teaches us what we should believe and how we should behave. So there's quite a debate among evangelicals. So evangelicals disagree about or emphasise differently many issues, not just Genesis 1 and 2. And I was reading recently a book by an evangelical biblical scholar, and he was saying the story of the woman taken in adultery. Do you remember it in John? He's an evangelical Bible scholar. He thinks it probably shouldn't be in the Bible because it's not in the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament and of the Gospel of John. Now you can imagine other scholars will not buy that at all. So there's room for disagreement, and I want to just end by saying it's possible for evangelicals to believe different things about Genesis 1 to 2, but still see it as authoritative. You can say it's literally all of it historically true. You can say it's partly historically true, as one scholar we're going to look at later will say. It's consistent with modern science. It's poetry. It's myth in the best sense of that word. Story with deep truths. And I want to say to you as my parting shot, can evangelicals learn to disagree well? Are we able to do that? And this was central to Paul. Do you remember when he was doing our series on homosexuality? Can we learn to disagree well? Can we stop bashing one another over the head because someone happens to disagree with something we believe? The evangelical community is broad, wide and diverse. We can passionately argue for what we believe in, but we can also learn to disagree well. I don't have to say, you disagree with me, therefore you're stupid, evil, immoral and wrong. Yeah, let's disagree well. Thank you. I've got 3 minutes. Can we open it for questions? Any questions or comments? Neil.
So, the arguments assessing younger creation seem to me to be, at least the ones you presented, missing the question about what does that tell us about the nature of God. Because it seems to me, if you're a younger creationist, you believe God is some kind of strict trickster who likes to mislead humans by putting all sorts of things in creation, suggests it was created differently from what it was.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you raised that, Neil. That's the omphalos theory, actually. It's the theory that what God has done is deliberately mislead us. He's made the fossil record look as though the Earth is very old when it actually isn't. And I'll take your word for it.
With the laws of physics, does radioactivity work differently back then from it does now?
Yeah, so it does raise exactly that question that you mentioned. Anyone else want to say anything?
Yeah.
Norman.
They say the world's millions of years old, but how can they guarantee how they can measure that? Because you've got nothing that you know is that old, really, do you, to measure it against? So that's something I can't get my head around. I don't think, it's old, yeah, but I can't get my head to agree that it's millions of years old because they've got nothing to measure it with.
There are 3 sources of that, if I can answer it very briefly.
Go on, very, very quickly, Neil, so we can get another question in.
Record where you can judge the ages of different rocks, and some of them are clearly billions of years old, and some of them hundreds of millions. There's the science of radioactive decay, where you measure how much radioactivity is coming up in different rocks, which tells you how old they are. We use the same thing to date things like old trees sometimes, and things like that. It's carbon dating, it's called. And the third one is astronomy, where you study the behaviour of how planets and stars are formed.
Yeah, I'd also add actually the background temperature of the universe and the fact that it's also expanding. So there are a lot of arguments which scientists put forward as ways of showing that the Earth is very old. Kirsty, did you have a question or did I just...
Yes, so to come back to your very first slide where you had the left and the right hand.
Yeah.
I think it was a
concordant, discordant.
Are they mutually exclusive, those views?
If you hold discordant views, so...
Those that are on the concordant side...
Of the concordant side.
Are they mutually exclusive or not?
No, not necessarily, actually. I would say the day-age theory and the gap theory may be exclusive, but kind of progressive creationism, evolutionary creationism, they're closer, even though there would be some disagreements. But they're all attempting to reconcile biblical accounts with science. Later on, I'm going to be looking at a theory from an evangelical scholar who said we don't even need to try and make them consistent. They're doing different things. You know, they don't need to agree. They're doing totally different things. And we'll see what you think of him. Okay, I think we're done. Thank you very much, everybody. It's great.